Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
Days of Feasting and Rejoicing, David Bergen's newest novel out through Goose Lane. I am pleased to be joined by David on the program. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Michael. Thanks.
So before we start talking about the book, I want to talk about talking about this book and whether you give thought to what you will say about a book or what you will share with an audience, when you're at a reading or explaining the book beforehand without kind of tipping your hand. Do you give some thought to that?
I'm not sure this is any different other than the fact that it has a bit of maybe you don't want to give the plot away. But I've never felt that I want to explain a book when I'm talking about it. Like when I introduce it, let's say I'm doing a reading, I don't go into a big introduction of what the book is about. Maybe I'll do a bit of a reading, and then there are some questions and that sort of thing, and the reader, hopefully, the reader's interest will be piqued, and then the book will be read. So that's sort of my how I work with talking about books.
Right. And I only ask this because there is something that happens pretty early in the book. And I'm not sure, should we address that in this conversation or is that something that's supposed to be, revealed to the reader or kept from a prospective reader, or if that's a consideration that weighs in when you're promoting a book?
Yeah. Oh, well, I think I know what you're talking about, that in the description of the book itself, and it's not in the novel, because it's not a hardcover, and it's not French flaps. There's no real description of what the book is about, but it's common knowledge, and I've talked about this before, that Esther Mail's friend Christine dies in a swimming accident, and there's a sense, and it's quite common knowledge as well that she decides she'd like to take on the identity of Christine. So that's I don't think that's giving anything away. I've just given it away, haven't I?
There we go. Okay. And so I was curious about, as an author, if you weigh those kinds of decisions when you're writing a book, or if you're thinking about kind of like the trajectory of a book after you've kind of typed the last period and what a conversation around a book is.
This one is a bit different. I didn't know, because it's I would say more than a slight departure for me. I call it a crime novel. It's not a mystery. It's more sort of watch her do it rather than who done it. So I don't see it as a mystery. Some have referred to it as a literary thriller. But going back to your original question, I think that a conversation around this book is a bit different because my previous one was more historical, more political. Perhaps went deeper in a different way than this one does. This is much more psychological and sort of a discovery, both by Esther herself and the reader, as to who she is and her longing to be someone else. So I knew that the conversations would inevitably be about the psychology of my main character, Esther Mail.
100%. And we do want to get to that. You mentioned this is a departure for you. What prompted that departure?
Well, it was prompted a long time ago, and I've said this before, but I actually wrote this novel 15 years ago and tried to sell it because I wanted to try something different from what I had done up to that point. I think I just published The Matter with Morris, which was maybe my ninth book, something like that, and my ninth novel. And I was looking for a way to maybe try something a bit looser, go in a different direction. And there's certain writers I admire who do that, and I wanted to have a go at it, and so I did. And then nobody wanted the book. It was interesting, and only about 13 years after that, which would be about 2 years ago, because of the time that sort of rolls out when you have a book accepted and when it's published. So it would have been 23. It was accepted. That some of the taste had changed. I think the zeitgeist had changed, and people said, "Oh, this is a book we'd like to publish." So it was sitting in the drawer for a long time.
It's fascinating to hear you say that it was from about 15 years ago that because reading this book, I was curious about like whether the adaptation Ripley, which
Yes.
became a phenomenon. I thought maybe this was kind of concurrent with that or prompted by that or something. But it sounds like it well predated that. But
Oh,
Patricia
definitely.
Highsmith, I think, is important in this book, right? Like that. If
Oh,
I'm not
yeah.
mistaken, she reads The Price of Salt.
Yes, you got it at the end. Yeah, yeah. That she is reading The Price of Salt, which was made into a movie called Carol with Kate Blanchett. But yeah, she's reading The Price of Salt, and that's very good reading, Michael. I don't say the name of the book, but it's sort of take a book, leave a book, and she picks up The Price of Salt and talks about it. There's enough references in the description of the book to uh, to sort of clue in the informed reader as to Patricia Highsmith's one of her earlier books.
And is that like a hat tip to the fact that like there's an element of like the talented Mr. Ripley to this book where there's someone who has something and someone who wants something and the like putting on of that personality or that embodying that person like that seems to be what Esther's doing with Christine.
Yeah, she is. I don't think it's peculiar to Patricia Highsmith. It's been done a lot. One of the blurbers mentions The Passenger, Antonioni's movie with Jack Nicholson, and there too, there's the sense of the main character, becoming someone who's dead and taking on that person's personality and identity. And maybe it's a common theme throughout literature that goes in this direction, that the sense of um, a character who longs for escape but doesn't know how to find that escape, and then finds that perhaps a possibility of escape in becoming another person, and also in realizing that, oh, I just took myself along, so I can never escape myself. So that's one of the things I'm dealing with in the book.
Yeah, obviously like Esther it seems to like kind of fall into this that like she's presented with this opportunity and she kind of just just blindly kind of does it without like any sort of forethought and then her criminality is kind of birthed by accident.
Yes, I would say that's a fair description of what happens to Esther. There was never any grand scheme where she thought that she would take on Christine's identity and become Christine. It just sort of one step led to another step, and then she's deep into the scenario where she has become Christine, and she's using her credit cards, her debit cards. She's writing people as if she were in the voice of Christine. She's writing, and she studies how she writes and how she talks, and I think that she it's always hard to know with Esther if what she's telling you is true or not. She tells different people that she has a brother who died, and then she tells people that she was a linguist, and I don't ever make it clear or definitive if that's in fact true.
Was that intentional, like that slipperiness of Esther's personality or her backstory that like the unreliability is exceptionally vivid for her?
Yes, it was intentional, and it was also intentional that I not provide any motivation, because that's typical. So you have typically, when a writer writes a book like this, there's backstory, and the backstory provides some sort of traumatic incident in childhood or in the past that has spurred them to behave in this way. It was important to me to not offer that to the reader and just present Esther in the present. And she has thoughts sometimes about the past, about her mother. She mentioned her brother, but for the most part, we don't know what her backstory truly is.
Why
So
was
that was intentional.
why was that important to you?
Oh, I think I don't like it when I'm offered by the writer an explanation for, okay, this is why this character is acting in a certain way, and there are characters in literature we don't know why Iago in Othello acts the way he does, and we don't know why Chigger in No Country for Old Men is the way he is. There's no backstory, none at all. Or the judge in Blood Meridian. There's just the act, and we watch him, and we marvel at sometimes the evil quality that is presented, but there's no backstory. And I wanted to do it that way.
It's interesting. I've heard Chigurh described as a shark, right? That like sharks are ruthless creatures, but it's not motivated, right? Like they don't need
Yeah,
a rationale for that behavior, right? Uh, Esther, though, like a more fumbling creature than a shark.
definitely. Yeah.
How important was it to kind of like make it believable that someone who had like kind of no necessarily like kind of criminal inklings would kind of how they would flounder or like go about crime?
In Esther's case,
Yeah.
I mean, there are hints early on in the way she speaks about herself in the third person, in her lack of friendships, her oddities, that she doesn't fit well in the world, and so it to me it was those were sort of hints at her personality, a lonely person, a defensive person, um, flirtatious, and then you have, of course, you have the flirtation, and then you have the danger that goes with that flirtation. So that that I think there were hints early on that that's who she was. Whether that is possible that a woman like this can be violent, well, it's fiction. I assume that if I could convince the reader that Esther could do this, then good enough. So I guess if I can convince the reader that this is Esther, then it's worked.
Yeah, Esther, I mean, like you said, we get glimpses of her, but she ultimately is like a little bit unknowable because we can't necessarily rely on her. But I think one of the most telling sequences with her is when she's kind of on the run and she's trying to be noticed but not noticed. That like
Hmm.
she kind of goes through these like points where there's like a push pull to like her ultimately she feels she's unnoticeable or like kind of bland and pushes against that and then notices people not noticing her, and she goes to the beach and the younger women kind of look at her and shrug her off, and the young men walk by, and that's ultimately why she ends up reading the Patricia Highsmith novel, is because she ends up alone on this beach, and
Yeah.
it really speaks to kind of like this crime that she's trying to embody Christine, and she dresses up in Christine's stuff, and like it's a very fascinating kind of push pull that you have
Yeah.
Esther kind of
I think you're right, Michael, that there is a push pull, and perhaps deep down, even she would might not know that. She, when you say she almost like leaves hints to people that who she is. She takes risks, and it's almost like subconsciously she wants to get caught, because if she's caught, then she'll be recognized. She'll be held up as sort of this, oh, this is the person that did this, and then she pulls back, and she doesn't want to be caught, and hence her running, and the extreme she goes to change herself, and to become Christine. So yeah, I think there is a subconscious part of her that probably thinks, you know, if I get caught, then at least people will know who I am.
right, and getting away with it means obscurity, which she's always been bristling at.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Obviously, Wantok, the police officer who is investigating this, is a central character to this story, and you do kind of like move away from Esther and follow Wantok home. How important was it to kind of not just have him, as an interrogator to Esther's plans, but to like have his own story?
I think, I mean, there too, that wasn't necessarily planned. Um, I know who he was modeled on. I have sort of an idea from when I lived in Thailand who he would be, and I found that particular person quite fascinating. And then as I started to write Wantok, I realized that there's more depth here than just the inspector who's sort of the foil for Esther, and it tells us more about Esther. But I wanted us to have a little bit more about Net Wontok and who he was, and to give him some a three-dimensional depth and open him up and show that he had his own demons that he was dealing with.
So then, like, how do you, with a secondary character like that, find the balance that, like, you give him enough backstory, you give him enough motivation and things that he's wrestling with, but that it doesn't necessarily take away from the thrust of the story.
Yeah, that's it. It became obvious to me. I didn't ever overwrite him, but I thought I gave him enough space on the page to make it so that there was a dynamic, and the dynamic between Esther and Net Wontok, the detective. In order to have a really strong dynamic, I think the reader has to have a really strong sense of who Net Wontok is and what his background is and where he comes from. If he's just a cardboard figure that appears, questions Esther, and then leaves, it doesn't have the depth, I don't think. But I didn't ever feel that I should be writing more of Net Wontok. I think I felt that I had just given just enough of him, and then back to Christine. I mean, back to Esther. See, I can't even keep them straight.
Yeah.
So yeah, so yeah, then back to Esther, and there's I mean, it's written in the very close third person voice. So what we call a free indirect, so that really you want the reader to believe that it's almost first person voice. But then when I switch to Net One Talk, I move away from that close third person and I move into another point of view.
You mentioned that you drew on your time in Thailand, and I was curious about kind of the placing it where you said it, and then also, like, early on there's a commentary on travelers and tourists, right? Like, Esther meets this guy Arndt, and they have an exchange about what she calls world travelers.
Yeah.
Is that something like you drew on from your own experience living there, or like were you kind of trying to process kind of that? Because the book, that period of the book reminded me of was Alex Garland's The Beach, that
Right.
like this, like going away to find yourself and,
Yeah.
immersing yourself in another culture, but never actually truly belonging to that culture. Was that something you were trying to echo?
I think I wasn't echoing the beach, but I know what you're referring to.
That notion, I guess, rather than the novel.
I I I mean, I spent 3 years there, and I had never really written about it. And I think for me it became. I mean, I set the house that Esther lives in is the house that I lived in with my family, and it was a duplex. And it had a gazebo out back, and it was sort of in the country. And you'd go down to the little shop to get a soup at the corner, and excuse me, there was a buffalo pond right across from us, and so it was very easy. It was very easy to have a setting and to remember. And so when you have that and you have that foundation, the story sort of it just takes off. And of course, there's the heat and there's the food, and the food plays an important role in the novel.
Yeah, it's so building that in, like integrating that, because this is a fairly brisk novel, right? Like it's
Yeah,
you
there's
know
200 pages and it rips along. Yeah.
how do you kind of thread the needle of like making sure that there's some verite and, like, setting scene and describing heat and food and things like that without maybe overdoing it, or like losing that pace.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I could easily be criticized for not having enough or having too much, but for me, it was everything had to be seen through the eyes of the characters. So the food, the heat, the sweating, the constant showering has had to be seen through Esther's point of view, and then also from Nat Wontong's point of view when he goes and makes this elaborate supper for his wife who's physically ill, and those details were important to the texture of place, but I also didn't want to overindulge and go, to go pages after page about food and the climate and stuff like that. So it had to be more from their point of view. They were living it. How did they see it?
Well, speaking from Esther's point of view, it is interesting, and I'm just thinking of this now, that talking about like that push pull of her wanting to be noticed and feeling invisible, that like she wants the trappings of wealth, but she feels kind of, Western guilt about, privilege and her status versus the folks who actually are from that country, right? Like that's kind of endemic to Esther's viewpoint as well.
You mean to say that Esther actually has empathy for the poorer people of Thailand? Is that what you mean to
She
say?
does seem to say like she acknowledges, and I think that's early on, is like she's jealous of Christine about like the way she embodies her wealth without like kind of
Well,
wrapping her head around privilege, and that like when she comes to kind of like wealth and food, like I don't think she's like necessarily happy with it, and that there is still that push pull of like getting what you want isn't what you actually want for Esther.
yeah, she is. Yeah, and I think you're right. She's very conflicted, and even as she's gathering up lucre, money, she's still conflicted, and this is something she's never experienced before, and so there is again that's a good example of the push pull of Esther Mail.
She has an exchange with Christine's brother Carl when he comes looking for her around kind of this, that like people don't ask what they're doing in Thailand because it's assumed they're trying to escape something back home.
Right,
And he says, like I would never want to escape my life, right? Like
right.
he lives his life as a pastor, and he couldn't imagine not talking about what his life is. Did you purposely like kind of choose a vocation for Carl that would set him up in some opposition to Esther in that sense?
Well, it's really interesting living overseas, and so we traveled down to Guatemala. We've been in Vietnam. We've been in Thailand. And what's interesting about you always meet the same people, and not sometimes they're actually the same people, but what I mean by the same people is they have a certain persona, and they're drifting. They're expatriates. They can't stand to live where they came from, and so they're looking for a place, safe place. But they also bring with them a passport. They bring with them privilege, and and a lot of them are missionaries. They're trying to convert people to their religion. And so that throws to have Carl as a pastor. Of course, he's not living there, but to have him as a pastor would be not far-fetched.
As a nod to the missionary.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's particularly just because of that exchange. I saw it as like this oppositional force to Esther, where like someone who lives their life exactly as they are versus someone who completely tries to obscure who they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which actually kind of brings me to another question around honesty. When she's trying to convince Chai of her plan, he's like, I would feel better if I told the truth. And she's like, to what end? Right. That like, is this something where, and I'm obviously like, you wrote this 15 years ago, but thinking back, like, were you wrestling with like, honesty is honesty the best policy? That like, is the notion of like telling everyone all the bare truths? Cause this, does speak to the now of like, are we our authentic selves, or do we hold something back, particularly on social media, that like, are we embodying ourselves, or are we keeping things from people?
Well, this brings us back to sort of the whole idea of the unreliable narrator, and it's always interesting. I've always had difficulty with that term, and people have used that in relation to Esther Mail, uh, only in the sense that I think we are all unreliable, and we make up stories about ourselves, and we try to present ourselves in a way that is favorable as opposed to not, unless we're very cynical and skeptical and maybe you know are inclined to tell the truth and we're trying to get ourselves in trouble. But for the most part, I think most of us have an unreliability about us that even when we face ourselves, we might think, was that truly me? Have I told the truth here? So I don't think that's an odd thing, even for people who don't go around hitting people over the head and trying to escape. I think that we all have a sense of unreliability in our own storytelling.
Is that why Wantok is seeing a therapist? That like because they have an exchange about like whether he truly needs to see a therapist or if that's like a Western issue that like the assumption being that his therapist only treats the foreigners.
Yeah, that maybe was a bit tongue in cheek. I think that was Net Wantok saying I'm not like you. I'm not like a Westerner. I don't need to go there. I don't need to look at the darkness inside me. Whereas it's as we learn, there is darkness inside him, and he's a bit lost as well. So I think the human condition is goes across the world. Humans are humans. Yeah.
That they are. The book. How did you land on the title? Because I was curious about like there is a passage, but like there were a multiplicity of titles I could have thought of for a book like this. Is this what you wrote 15 years ago, or did you land on it in the like 2 years back that you revisited this novel?
Oh no, I had it right away. And in fact, I've got I've got a quote here. Sorry, I'm just looking for it. But basically, so it comes from the book of Esther, in the Bible.
Mm.
So Queen Esther, um, she becomes the queen. She discovers a plot against the king and herself, and she has the person hanged, and then kills just and the book eponymous book, but it's called the Book of Esther. The book describes a slaughter of 75,000 Persians and a subsequent feasting and rejoicing. So the feasting and rejoicing refers to having a party after you've slaughtered your enemies. And so that I knew right away that would be the title of the book, Days of Feasting and Rejoicing, and it's a nod to the really odd perspective of eating and rejoicing and feasting after you've slaughtered 75,000 people.
Coming from the mouth of a woman named Esther.
Yeah.
Goes to show I know my Highsmith better than I know my Bible.
Yeah.
Days of Feasting and Rejoicing out now through Goose Lane. David, thank you very much for joining me on the show, and congratulations on the release of the book.
Thanks for reading so closely, Michael.